Happy New Year, everybody. Welcome to Semester 2. First set of notes for Semester 2. We're going to go ahead and jump right into it. Um, I will have to admit to you guys that I've been racking my brain probably for about the last week of winter break, trying to figure out how we're going to do some of this stuff virtually. And I'm getting some ideas, but I'm not sure how good they're going to come over. So we'll have to wait and see. We'll hopefully cross our fingers, and maybe by the end of the year we'll be back on campus, and I'll be able to do some of this stuff that is usually considered the fun stuff in class, the crime scene investigation stuff, um, on campus instead of some of this virtual stuff. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump right into this and get going. Okay. So the next set of notes is going to be focusing on crime scene investigation. Basically, the rest of the semester is focused on crime scene investigation. You guys get to play the part of the field mice that we talked about last semester and get to do some of this stuff. Some of the things that we need to hopefully get back on campus to do. I'm not sure how we're going to do virtually things like fingerprinting and doing dusting for fingerprints and doing crime scene photography and actually collecting evidence from virtual or from simulated crime scenes. I'm not sure how we're going to be able to do some of that stuff virtually, but we'll work our way through it and make the best of it and I'm going to try to push back some of that stuff that is fun to do and hands-on stuff as far as I can to hopefully be back on campus. But if that doesn't happen, we'll have to figure something out. Okay, we'll have to get creative. All right, so this set of notes we're going to focus on securing the crime scene. We'll demonstrate proper procedures to secure a crime scene, identify the scope of a crime scene, we'll be able to identify safety hazards that could be involved with crime scene investigation and then implement proper safety protocols like PPE equipment and stuff like that. And we'll briefly talk about that and we'll get into more details about some of this stuff as we go because a lot of this stuff is going to be done over and over again now. So from this point forward, you will always have to demonstrate proper procedures for securing a crime scene every time we do a crime scene. Okay? So let's go ahead and jump into the body of these notes and we'll get moving. Your assignment this week, and again, this is kind of difficult. I'm struggling with some of this, is going to be basically a demonstration virtually of how to secure a crime scene, and I'll explain the assignment a little bit more in detail later on. So basically for this assignment, you'll be videotaping the procedure on how to secure a crime scene. Normally, I would set up a crime scene right here, at Foothill somewhere, and I would have you guys come in with your crime scene investigation teams, and you would basically demonstrate your ability to secure the scene and tape it off and do all of that stuff. This year, we're going to have to do it virtually. So the assignment page is going to have the instructions, but in general, I'm going to give you a description of a crime scene, but the crime scene is going to be at your house. Now, you don't have to set up the crime scene or anything. You don't have to plant evidence and all that stuff. I would have normally done that on campus. So I'm just going to give you a description, and then you're going to kind of show me where in your house via a short 2 to 3 minute videotape where you would set up the boundaries, where you would tape it off, where you would enter the scene, where you would exit the scene, the staging area, that type of stuff. And you'll see the description of that in the assignment on Canvas. Okay. And that is going to be due. I think I made it due on Sunday just to give you a few extra days over the weekend if you need to do that. All right. All right. So let's go ahead and jump into this. So who's at a crime scene? And we've talked about this before. Crime scenes can be very busy. You could have, if for large crime scenes, you could have literally hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people all kind of involved in the crime scene and hopefully not stepping on each other's toes too much. But you have police officers there, general duty officers, investigative officers. You have, the crime scene people themselves, the lab specialists, the lab personnel, the investigators. You have legal practitioners, the prosecution, defense attorneys. You could have pathologists there if there's a death, if there's bodies or injuries involved. You could have paramedics, psychologists, psychiatrists all there. And then you also have the victims and the suspects, as well as the witnesses and possible media. It can be mayhem. So a professional crime scene investigator is going to be sensitive to all the needs of those above players, and at the same time try to do their job. So it's a little bit difficult. It can be a little bit um, overwhelming in some cases, and then other times it might be smaller groups. If it's a smaller crime scene, maybe it's not as high profile, maybe it wasn't as large, and you might only have a few people at the scene. So it just kind of varies from scene to scene. So let's go ahead and go through some of the roles that a crime scene investigator has to do. So one of the most important aspects of crime scene investigators' role is to establish clear and direct lines of communications. You see there's lots of people involved, right? Tons of people. So forensic experts, the investigators, everybody that's kind of involved in the basic crime scene, you have to have these open lines of communication, clear open lines of communication. This communication begins from the initial notification of a crime, attending the scene, through the various phases of the investigation, to the final presentation of any evidence at court, and then any subsequent appeal that may occur as well. The crime scene investigator has to perform the technical aspects of collecting, recording, examining, and analyzing all the physical evidence as part of that team. Okay, so you got to have these open lines of communication. It's not going to be, hey, you're intruding on my area or something like that. You got to actually kind of cooperate and work as a good team member, which is one of the reasons we put you in crime scene investigation teams, so you can learn to work with other people. Some of the most important aspects of crime scene investigation include securing the scene, preventing any contamination, and preservation of all the physical evidence. And that's one of the reasons we set up these boundaries. And it's kind of become almost like a symbol of crime scene investigation. You see that yellow tape up there where it says crime scene or, police line or something like that, and it says do not cross. That is your perimeter. So that's securing the scene. And basically, if you look even at that picture that's there, right, you see the only people that are inside that taped off area are going to be the people that are actually working the scene, the officers involved, the investigators, etc. So you really want to secure the scene, and that kind of takes care of the other two bullet points. When you secure the scene, hopefully you're preventing any kind of contamination from getting in there, and you're also preserving the physical evidence and keeping that safe and intact. So the personnel responding to a crime scene must approach and enter the scene cautiously. Remember, this is a crime scene, and we're looking for evidence, and some evidence is going to be really small. It's going to be trace evidence. It's going to be small pieces. It could be particles of dust. It could be hairs. It could be fibers. It could be something very small. And one wrong move or one wrong step, and you have some kind of important piece of evidence that's stuck to the bottom of your shoe, for example. Okay. Normally, when we do our first crime scene on campus, it's kind of fun because everybody's kind of usually on the first one um, tripping over each other and stepping all over evidence and making all these vicious notes and stuff like that when I'm actually observing you guys do this, and then I kind of give you guys a debrief and I say, look, we had somebody step right on a piece of evidence. We had somebody else, forget to put gloves on and they're touching everything around there and leaving their fingerprints behind. So there's always mistakes when you first do this, and the best way to get good at it is to kind of keep doing this practice right over and over again. So you got to approach the scene cautiously, be aware of the presence of other personnel, vehicles, ongoing events, any potential evidence that might be there, environmental conditions. You got to be aware of maybe even safety protocols that might be in place, because if you have blood or something like that, then you're going to want to have biohazard stuff on. If you have dangerous chemicals involved, you might need to have respirators on, etc. So they should be aware of the possibility of secondary scenes as well, multiple crime scenes, any initial observations such as the presence of distinctive odors or sounds, people that might have been around when you first arrive at the scene. All that has to be kind of taken into consideration. At this time, the investigator should also assess the site and give consideration to any safety, as I mentioned. Is there lots of blood? Do we need to work with biohazard stuff? Do we need to have respirators because there's, maybe it's a meth lab somewhere around and there's dangerous odors and stuff like that going on. So on the initial entry to the scene, the crime scene investigator should proceed with great caution, keeping in mind the potential to destroy evidence at the scene. Um, a plan should be formulated to minimize the destruction of any evidence by considering the initial physical approach. How are you going to get in? In particular, you want to kind of keep the following few bullet points in consideration, right? Use an entry other than that taken by the suspect. So if somebody crawled through the window, obviously you wouldn't crawl through the window, but also if they went through the front door, you're probably not going to go right through the front door. You might find a different approach to get into the scene, maybe a back door or side entrance of some sort to get into the building, because you don't want to trample through where they were walking and maybe, mess up some footprints or touch something that they have touched and smudge some fingerprints away or something like that. So usually you want to use an entry other than that taken by the suspect. You usually you kind of try to establish the path taken by other persons that were first on the scene. So if somebody did come in the door, you're going to make note of that. Hey, how'd you get in here when you found the dead body? Oh, I just came through the front door. Okay, well, you're going to make note of that because obviously that person may have dislodged some evidence or been in contact with some kind of evidence as well. You have to consider loss of any trace evidence on the entry throughout your examination. Um, you have to look at the OSHA issues, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. You got to be aware of, hey, what kind of PPE do we need? Do we need respirators? Do we need safety glasses? Do we need full out hazmat biohazard suits or what? And that's going to vary from scene to scene. You're going to have to establish the extent of the scene and additional assistance that might be required. Who, if any, types of specialists might be required to call up and bring in to help kind of process the scene. Establish an entry and exit path for the senior investigating officer and a specialist to enter the scene. So maybe you're going to have a staging area where all these personnel are going to come in and they're going to go through the staging area first and make sure that we're controlling who's entering and exiting the scene. We're documenting who's coming in and coming out, and we're making sure that they're not coming in a way that might disturb some of the other fragile evidence. The first responsibility of the initial responding officers is to secure the scene. It is basically their job to identify everyone present at the scene, take steps to prevent the alteration or destruction of any physical evidence by restricting movement and location and activity, establishing and defining and controlling the boundaries to the scene achieve this. The boundaries are often influenced by the location and the type of crime committed. Boundaries usually start at the focal point of the scene and then extend outward to include where the crime occurred, potential points of entry and exit the suspects and witnesses may have gone through, and then places where the victim or evidence may have even been moved. And you could even have secondary scenes. If we have a body that was transferred to the car becomes a secondary scene. And then if that car drives some distance away and drops a body into a field, that field becomes a secondary scene as well. So you have different locations that can occur as well. So why is determining scene boundaries so important? Well, that's going to basically protect all the evidence, and it's going to allow us to kind of make sure that the evidence is undisturbed until it gets processed. So these boundaries are critical in controlling the integrity of the evidentiary material and are achieved by setting up actual physical barriers. That's that yellow tape that you always see. Sometimes it's even, guards that are standing in certain areas to make sure nobody crosses that yellow tape. And then controlling the flow of personnel into and out of the scene. Documenting the entry of persons entering and leaving the scene and taking measures to prevent the loss or compromise of evidence from weather, footsteps, tire tracks, etc. And this could be, tire tracks of people driving up to the scene. If they're pulling into the person's driveway and there's potential evidence in the driveway, well, they might be driving over the top of some evidence. So if you look at this diagram, this was a diagram actually that I sketched for our procedural manual, our standard operating procedures. So if you take a look, in this case, they have a media area set up. They have the investigator staging area. They have a command area where maybe they're keeping all the evidence that they're collecting. And then you actually have the crime scene, which is inside this. So you may have multiple barriers. You might have tape around here and say, look, all media and cameras have to stay over here. The command area is going to stay over here. This is where we're going to keep all the evidence secure. staging where people are going to enter the scene are going to be coming through here, and we have to keep that kind of manned with some guards that are going to make sure only authorized personnel crossing those boundaries, and so on. So there's a lot, like I said, a lot of stuff going on, and you need to make sure that these boundaries are set up to kind of maintain the evidentiary value of that material that we're collecting. We don't want somebody traipsing in there and contaminating any kind of evidence, or even inadvertently or purposely walking away with some kind of evidence. So you usually have an inner perimeter and then an outer perimeter as well. All right. So the first step in routine crime scene investigation is evaluating a plan of action. So we're getting into how these crime scenes are going to be processed, right? And this is really the focus of the entire second semester. We're going to do this in a way that's kind of breaking it up. So when we get to certain pieces of evidence, like biological evidence, we'll go over the actual standard operating procedures on how we collect biological evidence. And then when we do some kind of trace evidence, hair, fibers, or something like that, we'll go over the actual standard operating procedures on how to collect that particular type of evidence. So we kind of focus on this and we break it up. Now, normally, we would have already covered some of this because we would have already done our first major crime scene, probably quarter two. But again, I'm trying to push a lot of this back as far as I can so we can at least do some of this funner, hands-on, more active stuff, hopefully when we're on campus. Now, I'm not going to be able to push it back forever, so hopefully if we get on campus, it'll be more sooner than later. But if not, we'll have to come up with some creative ways of doing some of this. But usually what I do is I do it in piecemeal. So I may cover 3 or 4 different types of evidence before we do a particular crime scene, so I know everybody knows how to collect that particular type of evidence. And then later on, I might give another 3 or 4 different types of evidence, and then we'll set up a different crime scene and plant different types of evidence for that crime scene, and so on. But the basic protocol for scene processing really can be summarized in several sequenced tasks. So there's several things you have to do, right? First, you're going to survey the crime scene. We kind of practice this with a little bit of a virtual walkthrough. When you walk through the scene, you're kind of surveying the crime scene. You're coming in, you're trying to make note of where the person came in, where they may have left, what happened, where the focus of the crime scene was, any type of, preliminary evidence that's out in the open that you don't necessarily have to search for, and so on. After that initial walkthrough, then usually you start with your photography. The forensic photographer comes in, and then you also have technicians searching for particular pieces of evidence. And as they find the evidence, they don't move it right away. They wait until the photographer can get over there, photograph the evidence with and without evidence markers. And we're going to get into photography in a lot of detail later. And then they'll start collecting. In addition to that, you have other individuals that might be mapping or sketching the crime scene, right? Making measurements of where all the evidence is and sketching it out. And then recording and documenting the location of any physical evidence. As you're collecting it, you're obviously documenting this, you're putting it into an evidence log, you're establishing a chain of custody and all that. And then searching for fingerprints and other physical evidence that might be a little bit harder to find. That usually occurs a little bit later. Anything that's potentially contaminating, like dusting for fingerprints, you would do after you kind of collect some of this other evidence. If you're swabbing for DNA, you're going to want to swab for DNA first because you don't want fingerprint dust all over your swabbed blood sample that you're going to send off for a DNA analysis. So you can do the fingerprinting and stuff like that, dusting for fingerprints usually later. To obtain the most useful evidence, the investigator must approach each crime scene in an organized, routine manner by conducting carefully executed searches. And that's where our standing operating procedures kind of comes in. It kind of lays out, here's what you do first, this is what you do next, this is what you do third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. And then it goes through how you would properly collect or analyze particular pieces of evidence if you're analyzing them on scene. By conducting carefully executed searches, following routine processing protocols, and standard operating procedures, the investigator will facilitate the preservation of fragile evidence and obtain the most useful evidence from the scene. All activities conducted at the scene and all observations made must be documented. So now we're going to start getting into how we're going to record this crime scene, right? So it must be documented as soon as possible to prevent the event, preserve the events and the information that you're writing down. Documentation can take the form of sketches, as I mentioned before. Written notes, you're going to be taking notes profusely. Okay, when we start doing a scene, everybody should be taking their own notes on what they experienced at that particular scene. Okay, and then you have documentation through photography and sometimes even video, and any kind of notes, as I mentioned before, plus the actual chain of custody and the forms that we're filling out becomes documentation as well. A well-documented scene ensures the integrity of the investigation and provides a permanent record for later evaluation. Documentation must be made of any observations at the crime scene. This includes the location of persons that may have been there, vehicles that were parked there when they showed up, items within the scene, the condition and appearance of the scene, sometimes even smells, odors, some obvious things can be noted as well. If you show up and there was a bonfire in the backyard of the residence and it looks like it just was recently put out, you would make note of that. That could be something that could give us some kind of clue as to the timing of events when we do reconstruction. Most records are made during the scene walkthrough, right? We're kind of recording things as we're walking through, we're making notes. And a lot of the forms that we're going to be using are going to be pre-made forms, and I'll tell you why we do that in a moment. But the investigator in charge and any personnel responsible for processing the scene conducts this, right? They're kind of taking their notes. During the walkthrough, a walkway other than the one established path of entry should be used to reduce contamination. You don't want to walk where the suspects potentially walked or the perpetrators potentially walked, or even witnesses, may have walked as well. Crime scene documentation may be conducted on pre-printed documents or forms designed for recording certain aspects of crime scene investigation. And here's why we do this. As we were preparing a couple years ago to compete at Skills USA, we started doing some mock crime scenes. And as we were doing them, we noticed that we were not getting very far in processing a scene in a very timely manner. You have 30 minutes to go in through this scene and actually collect the evidence and get out of there. So one of the things we found, there was two things that were really slowing us down. Taking measurements with the old-fashioned tape measures was way too slow because it occupied two of the members of the three-member team, and it took up just too much time. You got somebody holding this end of the tape measure, somebody pulling it over here and writing it down. It just took too long. So we handled that by actually using a rangefinder, which is what most people use anyway. You just push a button, click it, and it tells you, how many feet, how many inches, how many centimeters. You can switch it to metric, English, whatever, and it tells you exactly, your distance in. It can be done by one person, just holding it, pushing the button, and it records it, and you write it down. And then the other thing was, they were writing everything out just on paper, and they didn't really have the forms. And we found that if we have these pre-made forms for whatever, initial walkthrough, a log for who entered the scene, another log for the photography, for the photographs, and so on. If we just had it pre-made, we just fill in the blanks, and it was a lot faster than writing everything out. So these documents can include body outlines for recording injuries. It could include clothing outlines for recording damaging or staining. It could be data analysis sheets for simple recording, reference sheets, interpretation of basic laboratory presumptive tests, and so on and so on. It could be a variety of things, okay? And we're going to look at some of those in a few minutes. So there's normally about 6 important categories of documentation that are considered acceptable to any search. You have the administrative worksheet, the narrative description, the photographic log, diagram and sketching, evidence recovery log, and then latent print lift log, and then any kind of identification, collection, and preservation of evidence. Many of these forms are going to be standardized, as I mentioned. And what I'm going to probably do, maybe the second class this week, let's see, for you guys, well, it depends on which day you're doing this, because I'm recording this for both Monday and Tuesday class, but Thursday or Friday, I guess, we're going to go over some of these pre-made forms when we discuss the assignment, the securing of the crime scene assignment that we're going to be doing. So crime scene investigators' notes should always be well organized. An efficient way to organize notes is usually to take the notes chronologically. Official notes should be made first, outlining basic things like the basic facts, times, dates, names, locations, victims, suspects, etc. Brief notes about the scene, conversations, if you talk to a witness, what was said, receipt of any property. When making a detailed examination of the scene, one method is to use line notepad. If you use this method, it's good practice to actually number the pages and use headings. Headings should be used as much as possible. So if you're writing, hey, this is the initial walkthrough, you would write initial walkthrough, page 1, page 2, page 3, everything you're writing down. Written notes should be detailed and specific. It's imperative that the time is recorded for specific events or items uncovered during the examination. A good example, this is a great example of a particular note that you would find. You wouldn't just say, 3:05 p.m. a locking mechanism to rear door was broke, forced entry, or something like that. That's too basic. So notice it says 3:05 p.m. examined locking mechanism, rear door premises, Whitlock, double deadlock mortise type. So it's actually describing the type of lock. Forcing to the intersection of the door jambs 5 centimeters below the lock. The operation of the locking switch was extremely tight and appeared to have been damaged during the forcing. And then he even makes a note that red paint was recovered from the locking catch. That could be maybe some paint from the handle of whatever they were using to pry open the door, etc. So it has to be as detailed as possible. That's an example of a really good detailed note. And then finally, we got crime scene sketching. We're going to actually have a whole unit on this as well. Measuring a crime scene and preparing accurate scaled sketches are great assistants in criminal investigations. You should prepare scaled plans for crime scene. This is a practical way of helping to basically take crime scene notes, and you should endeavor to develop really good skills at sketching. It'll start with a rough sketch. It's usually a rough sketch there, and then we're even going to get some software, and when we get back on campus, we're going to have this software uploaded onto our little computer lab, and you'll be able to do these final sketches with basically a computer to kind of do this. And some of the computer software they have now is really cool. You can actually do, you do a floor plan like you see on this picture here, and then basically it automatically kind of can be transferred into a three-dimensional sketch, which is really cool. All right, so that takes us through the notes. Again, Thursday or Friday, depending on when you guys are watching this. But Thursday or Friday, when we meet again, we will be discussing the assignment, and I will be hopefully introducing you to some of these basic forms. You've already been introduced to a couple of the forms. I've showed you the first form for your virtual walkthrough that you guys did, but I'll give you some other forms that we're going to be using normally when we do our crime scene investigations. All right, guys, so that takes care of it. Welcome back. Happy New Year, and hopefully this helped you out, and we will be moving right along into semester 2, and I'm crossing my fingers, and I'm hoping that we get back on campus soon. All right, guys, have a good day.